quiet neighborhood awakened. The old and trembling hands of Mrs. Laura Berlin paused mid-trim as she carefully pruned her roses. Her eyes locked on an unexpected sight: two little black girls walking towards her house. The 80-year-old widow watched their every step, her heart beating faster than usual. With short curly hair bouncing as they walked, the twin girls carried a fear too heavy for children their age. When they reached the porch, Laura felt her breath catch in her throat, unable to look away from their anxious faces. The girls looked up at her, and in voices barely above a whisper, they spoke words that would completely upend her peaceful world. In that moment, Laura's life shifted. The appearance of the twins wasn't just unusual. It marked the beginning of a series of events she never imagined she would face. At 80 years old, Laura spent her days tending to the small garden behind her house. The blooming flowers and lush green plants had become her sanctuary in the quieter years of her life. Every morning, her old but steady hands delicately pruned her rose bushes and tended to her ferns. Each flower petal and leaf was a living reminder of the joyful days she had spent with her late husband, Thomas. Even though Thomas had been gone for nearly a decade, his presence lingered in the garden. Laura could still recall their afternoons spent watering plants together, laughing under the shade of the large oak trees. She could almost hear his voice, telling stories, as if he were still there beside her. The garden had become more than a refuge. It was a bridge between her past and present. As she worked, Laura fondly remembered the neighborhood as it once was, alive with the sounds of children playing, bicycles rattling down the street, and backyard barbecues filling the air with laughter and smoke. Those memories were vivid, like snapshots of a time when the neighborhood was full of life and joy. But over the years, things had changed. Many of the old families had moved away, replaced by strangers Laura never had the chance to meet. The once bustling street had grown quiet and desolate. The house next door, once filled with the energy of the Hartman family, now sat empty, its windows dusty, and a faded for sale sign propped in the yard. Every time Laura glanced in that direction, a sense of emptiness washed over her. Still, she held on to a flicker of hope. Deep down, she longed for change, a new spark to bring life back to the neighborhood. One morning, as Laura was trimming her roses, the rumble of a truck caught her attention. She looked up to see a moving truck pulling up to the house next door. Her heart fluttered with excitement. Finally, someone was moving in. Laura watched intently as a group of people began unloading boxes. She hoped for a young family, perhaps a couple with children who could fill the street with laughter and joy once more. The idea of hearing children's laughter or chatting with new neighbors brought a small smile to her face. The truck's doors opened and Laura's curiosity deepened. A black woman in her early 30s stepped out first, wearing a simple yet elegant pale yellow dress. Her hair was neatly tied back, and while her face held traces of worry, there was also a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Behind her, two twin girls about 6 years old stepped down holding hands. Their tight, curly pigtails bounced as they looked around, their large eyes filled with curiosity and shyness. One of the girls smiled timidly at Laura, and her heart melted. How long had it been since she'd seen children playing in the neighborhood? The quiet, lifeless atmosphere seemed to lift, replaced by a fresh breeze of possibility. As Laura continued watching, a tall white man stepped out of the driver's seat. His short hair, muscular build, and stern expression immediately caught her attention. Something about his demeanor unsettled her. He seemed so different from the woman and the girls. Was he the woman's husband, a partner, or someone helping them move? Whatever their story was, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The man stretched, his movements deliberate, and scanned the house and neighborhood with a scrutinizing gaze. His expression didn't reflect the excitement of starting fresh. It was something colder, more calculating. Laura's unease deepened. However, when the woman turned to wave at her with a warm smile, Laura's worries momentarily faded. In that brief exchange, she felt a spark of connection. Perhaps things would be all right after all. As the moving truck was unloaded, Laura noticed it carried only a few belongings. The family had arrived with only the bare essentials. No large furniture, no stacks of boxes. It made Laura wonder, were they starting over after a difficult time? Had they faced hardships that forced them to leave everything behind? She wanted to introduce herself, but she decided to give them space to settle in. The excitement of meeting new neighbors was undeniable, but she didn't want to intrude too soon. Returning to her roses, Laura's thoughts kept drifting to the family. Would they be good neighbors? Would the quiet street finally come alive again? As the sun set, Laura cast one last glance at the house next door. The curtains were drawn tightly, and no sounds came from within. She reassured herself that the family was probably just tired after the long day of moving. That evening, Laura sat in her living room, wrapped in an old cardigan Thomas had given her years ago. The soft glow of the firelight warmed her wrinkled face, and a cup of tea steamed gently on the table beside her. The hum of the television filled the room, but it couldn't drown out the quiet loneliness that crept in each evening. Laura's routine hadn't changed much since Thomas's passing. Every night, she would sip her tea and watch television, just as they used to. The empty chair beside her was a constant reminder of his absence. She could almost hear his laughter, his gentle voice telling her stories about his day. Her eyes lingered on the chair, imagining him there. The image brought comfort and sorrow in equal measure. Though years had passed, the ache of his loss remained sharp. She had thought she'd grow accustomed to living alone, but the truth was, with each passing day, she felt his absence even more profoundly. Lost in thought, a sudden noise outside startled Laura. Her head snapped toward the window, her eyes narrowing. The sound had come from the house next door, the new neighbor's house. For a moment, she thought a disturbing night. It might have been the sound of furniture being rearranged or a few items falling, Laura thought. But then a sharp, panicked scream echoed through the stillness of the night, and Laura's heart skipped a beat. She sat upright in her chair, her pulse quickening as unease crept into the air around her. For a few moments, Laura didn't know what to do. The scream replayed in her mind, louder and more unsettling with each repetition. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself it wasn't anything serious. Maybe it's just the kids being playful, she told herself. Perhaps they knocked something over while organizing. But the unease lingered. The sounds had been too sharp, too out of place to dismiss easily. Laura listened closely, but the neighborhood had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. Slowly, she rose from her chair, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain back. The house next door was still, the lights were off, and the curtains were drawn tightly, leaving no hint of activity inside. Laura hesitated, debating whether she should go check on them. It was late, and she didn't want to intrude, but something felt wrong. Unable to shake her unease, Laura decided to return to her chair. I'll check on them tomorrow morning, she resolved. To ease her worries, she made a plan. She would bake her signature lemon cake and bring it to the new family as a gesture of welcome. They just moved in. They're probably overwhelmed. I shouldn't jump to conclusions, she thought, trying to reassure herself. But deep down, the scream replayed in her mind, leaving a lingering discomfort she couldn't shake. A new day. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Laura's windows, dispelling some of the unease that had clung to her throughout the night. She told herself the strange noises had been nothing more than the chaos of a family settling in. Determined to move forward, Laura focused on her plan. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of sugar and fresh lemons as Laura prepared her lemon cake, her proudest recipe. The sweet, tangy scent brought a sense of calm, momentarily pushing aside the worry in her heart. Once the cake was ready, she carefully glazed it and placed it in a box, confident that this small gesture would help her connect with the new neighbors. Carrying the box across her yard, Laura rang the doorbell, her hands trembling slightly with nerves. The door opened to reveal Ellie, the woman she had met briefly before. Ellie wore a simple floral dress, her sun-kissed skin glowing softly in the morning light. Her tired but friendly smile instantly put Laura at ease. "Hello, I'm Laura, your next-door neighbor," Laura said warmly, holding out the cake. "I made this to welcome your family to the neighborhood." Ellie's face lit up, the weariness momentarily lifting. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, her voice kind and sincere. "I'm Ellie. We've just moved in, and there's still so much to do, but it's wonderful to have such a kind neighbor." Just as the atmosphere began to warm, a curt voice interrupted them. "Who is she?" A tall, muscular man stepped into view. Joe, Ellie's boyfriend, stood in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His tone was sharp, and his presence was imposing, filling the doorway as though to block Laura's view inside the house. Ellie introduced Laura quickly. "This is Mrs. Laura, our neighbor. She brought us a cake to welcome us." Joe's expression didn't soften. "We're still very busy unpacking," he said flatly. "Thank you for the cake, but I think it's best you leave now. We'll reach out if we need anything." Laura blinked, caught off guard by his rudeness. The tension in his voice, the way he blocked the doorway, and Ellie's downcast expression all unsettled her. "Oh, of course," Laura managed, forcing a polite smile despite the unease swirling inside her. "I just wanted to say hello. If you ever have time, feel free to stop by for some tea." Ellie gave her a weak smile, but Joe only nodded curtly before closing the door firmly behind him. Uneasy observations. Back in her garden, Laura's mind couldn't settle. She replayed the brief interaction over and over. Ellie seemed kind, but her smiles felt forced. Joe, on the other hand, exuded a cold control that made Laura uneasy. The atmosphere in the house next door didn't feel right. That night, strange noises drifted from the house again. Muffled voices, hurried footsteps, and what sounded like faint screams kept Laura awake. She told herself she was being overly suspicious, but her gut told her otherwise. Something was off about that house. The next afternoon, while watering her garden, Laura noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning, she saw the twin girls, Ellie and Joe's children, slowly making their way toward her house. Their small frames seemed hunched, as though they were trying to make themselves invisible. Every few steps, they glanced back at their house. Fear etched across their faces. Laura set down her watering can and walked to her porch, opening the door just as the girls arrived. Their wide, anxious eyes locked onto hers, silently pleading for comfort. "Hello, dears," Laura said softly, crouching down despite her stiff knees to meet them at eye level. "What's wrong? Is everything all right?" The girls exchanged nervous glances, staying silent for a moment. Finally, one of them stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The words hit Laura like a blow to the chest. Her breath caught as she stared at the small, frightened child in front of her. "What do you mean, dear?" she asked gently, her voice trembling. "What has he done?" Before the girl could respond, a booming voice shattered the moment. "What are you girls doing over there? Get back here, now!" Joe's deep, menacing tone made both girls freeze in place, their small bodies stiff with fear. One of them whispered urgently, "We have to go," and they ran back toward their house. Laura stood frozen, her heart pounding. The girls glanced back at her one last time, their eyes filled with desperation. Then Joe appeared, his heavy footsteps pounding against the ground. He grabbed each girl by the arm and yanked them toward the house. "Get inside," he growled through clenched teeth, his voice low and threatening. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in Laura's mind as she remained rooted to her porch. Her hands trembled as the reality of what she had witnessed sank in. New daddy doesn't like us." Those words repeated in her mind, each time cutting deeper. Back inside her home, Laura sat in her armchair, her thoughts racing. She couldn't ignore what she had seen, the fear in the girl's eyes, Joe's rough demeanor. She knew something was wrong in that house. But what could she do? Was she reading too much into this? Was it her place to interfere? Laura wrestled with these questions as the sun dipped below the horizon. Deep down, she knew the fear she had seen was real, and she couldn't simply sit by and do nothing. A decision. How could she live with herself if she chose to do nothing? The questions circled relentlessly in Laura's mind. Memories of Joe, Ellie, and the two little girls played over and over. The strange noises at night, muffled cries, Joe's controlling demeanor, and the fearful looks on the girls' faces. Each incident on its own might be dismissed, but together they painted a troubling picture Laura couldn't ignore. She thought of her late husband, Thomas. He had always been quiet but wise, a man of sound judgment. What would Thomas do in this situation, she murmured, seeking advice from the memory of her beloved. She could almost hear his gentle voice, urging her to trust her instincts and prioritize the safety of children. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. Her finger hovered over the keypad, torn between fear and resolve. What if she was wrong? What if her concerns caused unnecessary trouble for an innocent family? But then she remembered the terror in the girls' eyes, the way they shrank as if trying to disappear. No child should ever feel that way in their own home. Taking a deep breath, Laura made her decision. She dialed 999. The calm voice of the operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? Laura hesitated, her voice unsteady. I'm not sure if this qualifies as an emergency, but I'm very concerned about my neighbors, especially the children. Can you tell me more about what's concerning you, ma'am? The operator asked patiently. Laura slowly recounted everything she had seen and heard over the past 2 days. The strange sounds at night, Joe's aggressive demeanor, and most importantly, the words of the little girl. Our new daddy doesn't like us. Her voice cracked as she recalled the fear in their eyes. The operator listened attentively, asking clarifying questions. When Laura finished, there was a pause before the operator spoke again, her tone serious. Thank you for reporting this, ma'am. We take potential child endangerment cases very seriously. I'm dispatching officers to your location to investigate. Can you provide your address and that of your neighbors? Laura gave the necessary information, feeling a mix of relief and worry. She had set something into motion, something irreversible. Officers will arrive shortly, the operator assured her. Please do not intervene yourself. Stay in your home and wait for the police. Hanging up, Laura sat back in her chair, her heart racing. Had she done the right thing? She didn't know. But as she thought again about the girl's frightened eyes, she knew she couldn't have remained silent. The arrival. Time seemed to crawl as Laura waited for the police. She paced her small living room, her eyes darting to the window every few seconds, searching for any sign of movement next door. The usual stillness of her quiet street now felt oppressive, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Just as her anxiety reached its peak, she heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder. Moments later, 2 police cars turned onto her street, their lights flashing silently. Relief washed over Laura as she saw 4 officers step out, 2 men and 2 women, all projecting calm professionalism. The officers quickly conferred by their vehicles before splitting into 2 pairs. 2 approached Laura's house while the others headed to the neighbors. A firm knock on her door startled Laura even though she had been expecting it. She hurried to answer and was met by a middle-aged male officer and a younger female officer. Good afternoon, ma'am, the man said in a steady but friendly tone. I'm Officer Mark, and this is Officer Jane. We're responding to the call you made about your neighbors. Are you the one who contacted us? Yes, Laura said, nodding. I'm Laura Berlin. Please, come in. She led them to her living room where they all sat down. Officer Mark pulled out a notepad, while Officer Jane's sharp eyes discreetly scanned the room, noting every detail. Laura felt a mixture of reassurance and nerves under their scrutiny. Mrs. Berlin, could you walk us through what led you to call us today? Officer Mark asked, his pen poised. Laura took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She recounted everything, the unsettling noises, her uneasy encounter with Ellie and Joe when she brought over the lemon cake, and, most importantly, her conversation with the twins. Our new daddy doesn't like us. Those words still echoed painfully in her mind. And when she finished, the officers exchanged a serious look. Officer Jane's expression deepened as she asked, You're certain the little girl said, our new daddy doesn't like us? Yes, Laura said firmly. That's exactly what she said. And if you'd seen their faces when Joe called them back, I've never seen children so terrified. Officer Mark finished jotting notes and looked up. Thank you, Mrs. Berlin. You did the right thing by calling us. We take this very seriously. What happens now? Laura asked, twisting her hands in her lap. We're going to conduct a welfare check on the family next door, Officer Jane explained. We'll speak with the adults and, if possible, find a way to talk to the children separately. Our colleagues are already there, Officer Mark added. We may need more details later. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement if necessary? Of course, Laura replied without hesitation. I'll do anything to help those girls. As the officers stood to leave, Officer Jane paused at the door, her eyes sincere. Mrs. Berlin, thank you for your attentiveness and courage. Many people ignore situations like this, but your actions today may make a real difference. Laura felt a lump form in her throat. I just hope everything will be okay, she whispered. We'll do our best, Officer Mark reassured her before stepping outside. The confrontation? Laura watched anxiously from her window as the officers approached Joe and Ellie's house. One officer knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no response, and the street remained eerily quiet. Then the door opened, and Ellie appeared, her nervous posture immediately apparent. The officer spoke calmly, but Laura could see the tension in Ellie's face. Moments later, Joe emerged, his imposing figure filling the doorway. Even from across the street, Laura could feel the hostility radiating from him. His scowl deepened, and his stance was more aggressive than protective. Joe's voice rose, his anger audible even to Laura. Though she couldn't make out the words, his fury was clear. The officers remained calm, one speaking soothingly while the other kept a watchful eye on Joe. The male officer eventually stepped between Joe and Ellie, creating a barrier as tensions escalated. Suddenly, Joe's booming voice shattered the night. "You have no right. This is my house. Mind your own business." Laura's chest tightened as she gripped the window frame. She couldn't help but think of the twin girls, wondering if they were inside, scared and cowering. The thought sent a wave of dread through her. Joe's voice rose again, filled with raw anger. "You have no right. You can't talk to her alone." Chaos and resolve. Laura gasped as Joe lunged toward Ellie, his hand outstretched as if to grab her. In an instant, the officer sprang into action. The male officer restrained Joe swiftly, while the female officer guided Ellie away from the door. The situation erupted into chaos as Joe struggled furiously against the officers, his face twisted with rage. Laura stood frozen at her window, her heart pounding. She caught a fleeting glimpse of movement from an upstairs window. For a brief moment, two small faces peered out from behind the curtains, the twins, before vanishing again. Laura raised a trembling hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "This is all my fault, isn't it?" she wondered, guilt flooding her chest. "I set this in motion with that phone call." But deep down, a quiet voice reassured her she had done the right thing. Whatever was happening now, it was bringing to light the hidden suffering that had been festering in that house. Laura realized with sinking certainty that, after this night, nothing would ever be the same. Ellie's breaking point. As Joe was subdued and led away in handcuffs, Ellie stood beside Officer Jane, partially hidden by a large rhododendron bush. From her window, Laura could see the tension etched into Ellie's face. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were holding herself together. Officer Jane spoke softly, her posture calm and understanding, creating a space for Ellie to feel safe. At first, Ellie shook her head repeatedly, avoiding eye contact, as though she couldn't face the harsh reality unraveling around her. But Officer Jane persisted, her words gentle yet coaxing. Laura watched as Ellie's shoulders began to tremble, her defenses crumbling under the weight of her emotions. Then, as if a dam had burst, Ellie broke into sobs. Her body shook with grief, releasing years of pain and exhaustion. Laura's heart ached, watching from afar. She longed to rush out and embrace Ellie, to tell her everything would be all right. But she knew this was Ellie's moment, a turning point she had to face on her own. Officer Jane placed a comforting hand on Ellie's arm, whispering words of empathy and reassurance. Ellie cried for several minutes, her sobs raw and unrestrained. When her tears finally subsided, she began to speak, her voice shaky and punctuated by hiccups. Though Laura couldn't hear her words, she could see the anguish etched into Ellie's face. As the conversation continued, Laura noticed a subtle shift in Ellie's posture. Her hunched frame began to straighten, and a small but growing strength seemed to return. Each word she spoke appeared to lift some of the burden from her shoulders. Eventually, Ellie nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Officer Jane looked her in the eyes, speaking firmly, decisively. Ellie nodded again, this time with a flicker of determination that hadn't been there before. Joe's desperation. A commotion erupted near the front of the house, and Ellie flinched at the sound. Joe's voice, filled with fury, echoed as he struggled against the officers. "You have no right. This is my house. Mind your own business," he bellowed. The male officer stood firm, speaking calmly despite Joe's escalating rage. Joe's shouts grew louder, his desperation palpable. "Ellie, baby, tell him this is all a mistake," he pleaded as Ellie emerged from the side yard, her face streaked with tears, but her expression resolute. "You know I love you and the girls. We're happy, aren't we? Tell them." Ellie flinched at his words, but she didn't retreat. With Officer Jane by her side, she stood tall, her voice soft but unwavering. "No more lies, Joe. It's over." Joe's face twisted in fury. You ungrateful, he snarled, lunging toward her despite his cuffed hands. The officers immediately restrained him, pulling him back. That's enough, one officer said firmly. You're under arrest for domestic abuse and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the officer recited Joe's rights, Ellie's shoulders sagged, as though a massive weight had finally been lifted. She let out a shaky breath, her resolve holding steady. The reunion. As Joe was escorted to the police car, his angry shouts now muffled behind the slammed door, Laura's attention shifted. Another officer emerged from the house, gently leading the twin girls outside. They clung to each other, their wide eyes scanning the chaotic scene in fear. When Ellie saw her daughters, she broke free from Officer Jane's protective watch and ran to them. Dropping to her knees, she pulled the girls into a tight embrace. The three of them huddled together, their bodies trembling with sobs, a mix of relief and lingering fear. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she watched the emotional scene unfold. The pain in that small family was undeniable, but so was their unbreakable bond. In that moment, Laura knew she had made the right choice in calling the police. She had given Ellie and the girls a chance at freedom, at safety. A new chapter? As the police prepared to escort Ellie and her daughters to the station, Ellie glanced at the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered on the lawn. Her gaze finally landed on Laura's window. Across the distance, the two women, one elderly with silver hair, the other a young mother filled with worry, shared a moment of connection. Ellie's lips curved into a faint smile, one of gratitude and acknowledgement. Laura raised her hand in a small wave, trying to convey all her support and empathy in that simple gesture. The smile Ellie returned was fleeting, but it carried a world of meaning. As the police car carrying Ellie and her daughters drove away, the neighborhood slowly returned to its eerie quiet. The gathered neighbors dispersed, their hushed conversations fading into the night. Laura stood by her window, her heart heavy with reflection. Just as she turned to step away, another movement caught her eye. The police car had returned, and Ellie stepped out, her daughters clutching her hands tightly. They stood on the street, unsure and vulnerable, as though standing at a crossroads. To Laura's surprise, the twins suddenly let go of Ellie and ran straight toward her house. Without hesitation, Laura rushed to the door and flung it open just as the girls reached her porch. Their small faces were streaked with tears, their wide eyes filled with both fear and hope. Despite the ache in her aging knees, Laura knelt down and opened her arms. The girls ran into her embrace, their tiny bodies trembling. "Oh, my sweethearts," Laura whispered, holding them close. "You're safe now, you're safe." One of the twins looked up at her, her tear-streaked face filled with gratitude. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried a profound weight. "Thank you for helping us," she said, a renewed purpose. That simple statement, "thank you for helping us," shattered and mended Laura's heart all at once. She hugged the twins even tighter, silently vowing to protect them, to shield them from the pain and uncertainty that had shaped their young lives. "You're both so brave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "So very brave." Out of the corner of her eye, Laura saw movement. Ellie was slowly making her way across the lawn, her steps hesitant but determined. As she reached the porch, Laura could see the mixture of emotions playing across the young mother's face. Gratitude, shame, relief, and a lingering hint of worry. "I'm so sorry," Ellie began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say or how to thank you." Laura shook her head gently, still holding the twins close. "There's no need to thank me, dear," she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I just did what anyone should do." Ellie's composure crumbled at those words. She sank to her knees beside Laura and her daughters, tears streaming down her face as the weight she had carried for so long finally lifted. "I was so scared," Ellie confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to get out, how to protect my children. I thought no one would believe me." Laura reached out, taking Ellie's hand in hers. "You're the brave one," she said gently. "It takes immense courage to speak up, to break free from that control." For a while, they sat together on Laura's porch, a mismatched group connected by compassion and care. The twins nestled between Laura and Ellie, their sobs finally subsiding into steady breaths. Ellie squeezed Laura's hand, drawing strength from the elderly woman beside her. "Thank you," Ellie said again, this time with a stronger voice, one filled with resolve. "For everything." Laura smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "We'll get through this together," she promised, and she knew without a doubt that they would. A new chapter. After Joe's arrest, Laura's role transformed. Once a quiet and lonely neighbor, she became a pillar of support for Ellie and her daughters. Her home, which had been so still, now overflowed with warmth and life. The dining table, once set for solitary meals, was now filled with lively conversations and shared laughter. Ellie visited often, not only for guidance, but also for the companionship of a wise and caring friend. Over steaming cups of coffee, Laura offered encouragement and wisdom, becoming Ellie's anchor during difficult times. Jessica and Julie, once frightened and withdrawn, began to thrive in Laura's presence. At first, they were shy, hesitant during their visits, but Laura's patience and kindness slowly erased their fears. When Ellie attended legal appointments or counseling sessions, Laura cared for the girls, telling them stories, guiding them through the garden to pick flowers, or engaging in imaginative games. Their laughter echoed through her house, turning it into a vibrant and joyful space. But Laura's support wasn't just emotional. With her steady guidance, she helped Ellie navigate the maze of legal forms and social services. The dining room, once a place for quiet tea, transformed into a workspace cluttered with papers and documents. Together, they reviewed every detail, ensuring Ellie received the assistance she needed. Laura became more than a listener. She became a partner in Ellie's journey toward rebuilding her life. As time passed, Ellie grew stronger. The once exhausted mother began to stand taller, her voice more confident, her eyes filled with hope. Jessica and Julie, who had once cowered at every noise, now ran freely through Laura's garden, their laughter a testament to the healing they had found. A special bond. On one warm evening during one of their now irregular family dinners, Julie, the more curious twin, paused mid-meal. Her wide eyes sparkled with thought as she looked at Laura with an unusual seriousness for someone so young. "Are you our guardian angel?" Julie asked softly, her innocent voice carrying the weight of sincere curiosity. The unexpected question brought a brief silence to the room. Laura froze, tears welling in her eyes at the child's remark. Her heart swelled with emotion. Since Ellie and her daughters had entered her life, Laura had found a renewed sense of purpose. But she had never imagined her role would be seen as so important. "Oh, sweetheart," Laura replied gently, smiling warmly. She reached out and brushed Julie's curly hair. Her voice trembled with emotion. "I'm just a neighbor who cares about you." Ellie, sitting across the table, watched the exchange quietly, her own eyes filled with gratitude. Life had transformed since Joe's arrest. The early days of fear and uncertainty had given way to peace and a sense of safety. Ellie knew, with every passing day, that without Laura's support, she wouldn't have made it through. Ellie reached across the table, gently grasping Laura's hand. Her voice was soft but filled with deep sincerity. "You're so much more than just a neighbor to us, Laura. I don't know how we would have managed without you. You didn't just help us survive the worst days. You gave us hope for a better future." Laura smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She hadn't expected that her presence could make such a profound difference in their lives, and yet, helping Ellie and her daughters had brought new meaning to her own life. A renewed life. Before Ellie and her daughters moved next door, Laura had thought her days of joy and purpose were behind her. Her life had felt like an endless stretch of solitude, filled only with memories of her late husband, Thomas. The quiet of her home had been suffocating, her days marked by the absence of laughter and connection. But everything changed when the twins knocked on her door. What began as a neighborly gesture of kindness turned into a journey of healing and love for Ellie, her daughters, and Laura herself. Ellie and her girls brought life back into Laura's home. Their laughter filled the once silent rooms, their playful footsteps brought energy to her garden, and their companionship replaced loneliness with joy. And in helping them rebuild their lives, Laura found that her own heart had been healed. On her porch one evening, as she watched the twins chase fireflies in the garden, Laura reflected on how much her life had changed. She'd once believed her best days were behind her. Now, she knew that even in her twilight years, there was room for love, connection, and purpose. Laura's life changed forever when the twins knocked on her door. Through her kindness and courage, Ellie and her daughters found safety and hope, while Laura herself rediscovered the joy of living. Do you believe that one small action can change someone else's entire life? If you found this story meaningful, share it with others and spread the message of compassion and courage.